Oi, what are you doing here, mate? It's the night of the hunt. I'm here for the party. Party? What party? The Bloodborne party? The Bloodborne? You know that party was like 3 years ago, yeah? I was making my costume. Well, I can see that, but it doesn't change the fact that the party's been over for years now. Well, I brought blood oranges. I thought it'd be very funny and thematically fitting for... Wait. You know this world's inhabited by fruits and veg, yeah? How many innocent oranges did you have to kill to get a bowl full of them? And not only that, I don't even live in the same house anymore. How'd you find out where I lived? There might have been a few more reasons why it took me 3 years to arrive. That's twisted, mate. What happened to you? Bloodborne party. Hello, everyone. I'm Cucumber, and I have recently completed Bloodborne for the 3rd time, and I've now seen all the endings. And I must say that this was definitely one of the most unique and gripping experiences FromSoft has crafted. From Yharnam to Mensis, I could not put my controller down, and I genuinely loved this game. I cannot say that there were not definitive issues that I had with Bloodborne, but for the TLDR of this video, Bloodborne has found a high place in some of my favorite games. Also, I need to point out that to play Bloodborne, I had to borrow my friend's game disc and subsequently use my roommate's PS4, so I did not get the chance to play the Old Hunters DLC. So, all I will be reviewing is the base game. If some of my critiques or praises change or are fixed in the DLC, then please inform me. Other than that, let me dive right into this video by discussing the aspects that I enjoyed the most while playing Bloodborne. Exploring the blood-ravaged Yharnam was exquisite. While the world as a whole is mostly linear in fashion, the way that each level is interconnected and looped around one another felt like a return to form after the levels in Dark Souls 2. However, due to the length of the game being as short as it is, there are actually only a few levels total in Bloodborne. In order to make up for lost ground on that front, my assumption is that From decided to make the levels larger as a result. Everything comes full circle there because, due to each level's immense size, implementing more shortcuts and connections became a necessity. Another effect the larger level design had on me was the fatigue that I felt delving further into the depths or ascending city streets. I've not felt this degree of, where is the next lamppost, or bonfire in Dark Souls, since I played Dark Souls 1. I sense a domino effect coming into play here concerning Bloodborne's levels. Because levels are so large, From made them interwoven with numerous shortcuts and side routes to take. Having all these shortcuts then allowed the level designers to place a lamppost sparingly, to inspire that sense of relief after discovering the next lamp. The more I talk about it, the more giddy I get, because I have been so accustomed to the levels of Dark Souls that the ease of traversing them has numbed me just enough for the Bloodborne to get me back into gear. The next aspects of the levels were their aesthetics, and I very much appreciated the gothic theme prevalent throughout the game. Unfortunately, after playing through Dark Souls 3 so many times and running around Lothric for so long, I almost saw Yharnam as a lower resolution Lothric. I cannot fault the game for that, of course, because Dark Souls 3 came out after Bloodborne. It is to be expected that the graphical fidelity would increase. At the same time, instead of being a single branch of the game like it is in Dark Souls 3, Bloodborne revolves around that gothic setting, and it does a much better job than what now appears to be the copy-pasting Dark Souls 3 did from Bloodborne. Also, I really took notice to the smaller set pieces peppered on the streets and the buildings of Yharnam. This world has gone through something terrifying and sudden. These people dropped everything they were doing and either started barricading their homes or picking up weapons to fight the beast scourge. I also adored how time progressed throughout the game as bosses were killed. Starting with early evening and eventually finding yourself in the dead of night was very enthralling. I really liked how the moment night fell upon Yharnam, select enemies would disappear and others would be asleep. Just an additional detail that caught my eye. Overall, Bloodborne's world design, both mechanically and aesthetically, impressed me, and it also reminded me that FromSoft is still more than capable of creating a cohesive, immersive, and believable world. The next thing I want to discuss is the combat, and in Bloodborne, it was quite an adjustment after playing something as methodical as Dark Souls. The fast-paced combat that borderline threw the thoughtful process of Dark Souls combat out the window in favor of making risk the only way to reap the ultimate reward was something that took me a while to get used to, but it was totally worth it. I cannot remember the last time I had so much fun fighting and controlling my character than I have in Bloodborne. The first change that I appreciated was that to the backstabs with the implementation of visceral attacks. Combat was no longer a simple act of circle strafing and repeatedly backstabbing like it was in Dark Souls. A visceral is calculated and slow, something one cannot easily do in the midst of normal encounters with both bosses and trash mobs alike. Managing to successfully execute a stealthy visceral attack is now much more rewarding, impactful, and less exploitable. Secondly, the rally system was one of the more unique implementations that I really enjoyed utilizing. Coming off a quick, dodge-based R1 spamming playstyle from Dark Souls that avoided taking damage at any cost, I felt would be an easy transition into Bloodborne. However, it was not so cut and dry. Suddenly, any damage I took could be recouped through a little dash of retaliation, and taking damage was not as central of an issue as it is in Dark Souls. Bloodborne encourages aggression, and me taking a headfirst approach to combat was rewarded, which I took a liking to very quickly. Next are the weapons. Trick weapons were such a good implementation of the game that I almost do not even have words for them, but I will try regardless. In Dark Souls, you can either one-hand or two-handed weapons. While you do get a slightly differing moveset when you do one or the other, it is not too significant. Bloodborne shakes things up, as the difference between one-handing and two-handing is like night and day. You might as well be handling two different weapons when you go from slashing a sword into crushing skulls with a block of iron. Even the not as significant change of the Hunter Axe by lengthening its grip provides a completely varied playstyle with the extended reach and the focus on wide horizontal slashes over its more vertical one-handed moveset. I can only imagine the depth of some other weapons available have in store for later playthroughs, and I look so forward to trying them. One issue I did have with the aspect of the combat was the parrying. Having the parry be tied to a limited resource in the Quicksilver bullets did really nothing but deter me from ever trying to parry the average enemy. I did use them freely, and poorly, against both bosses and hunter NPCs, but me wanting to avoid the need for an arbitrary grind for bullets down the road, I simply refrained from using the bullets outside those rare instances. This fear caused me to not be very good at the parry system, and while it is on me for being such a stickler about the bullets, I feel like tying parrying to something that is finite was a very silly decision. Now, I wanted to discuss some of the aspects of Bloodborne that were causes for concern in my experience. The issue with trying to articulate what I do have troubles with in Bloodborne is challenging because I do not necessarily know where to start. Now that I mentioned challenging, how about we start with the difficulty of the game? I want to preface this by saying that everyone has a different experience when it comes to these games. It is one of the defining features of the Dark Souls Bloodborne package. As for me, I have a real issue with Bloodborne because it felt too forgiving. You can boil it down to the fact that I've played several hundred hours of the Dark Souls trilogy, but I do not believe that the problems with Bloodborne's difficulty are a one-note issue like that. The first component that contributes to the difficulty problem would be the combat. The combat was one of the most engaging components of the game, but at the same time, it made many situations much too easy because, as I said in my combat section, taking damage is not as detrimental to you in Bloodborne due to the rally system. Therefore, having mistakes not mean as much by default makes the game more forgiving. Unfortunately, I do not have an immediate answer to solve this gripe because the combat dynamic heavily relies on the rally system to make it as unique, intricate, and engaging as it is. Secondly, I felt as if the power curve leans too far in favor of the player. In other words, I got too powerful too quickly. I focused on strength and used the Hunter Axe for most of my playthrough. As a result, I just pumped points into vigor, endurance, and strength whenever I leveled up. After upgrading my weapon a few times, I would destroy anyone who even glanced at me wrong without a second thought. I always had this thought in the back of my mind that I had inadvertently overleveled, even though I had never grinded for blood echoes. I did die more often than the average bear, thus allowing me to gather more echoes, but even then, I still felt too powerful for how much I had actually accomplished. And I cannot discuss the difficulty of Bloodborne without mentioning the bosses. As much as it pains me to say this, the bosses, at least in the main game, also felt too easy. I definitely had a little pushback from bosses like Gascoigne and the Bloodstarved Beast, but other than them, none of the bosses were particularly challenging or memorable at that. I felt as if I did not get the chance to actually appreciate the boss's intricacies in detail because I was not around long enough for me to notice. I was able to walk in and walk out without really understanding what had just happened. Remember, I do not have the DLC, so I did not have access to bosses like Ludwig, Maria, or the Orphan of Kos, which are all notorious for their difficulty. Also, something that I thought I would point out concerning the bosses was their physical designs. While they were beautiful aesthetically, in certain lighting, I did not enjoy the overabundance of monsters the size of school buses with thyroid conditions. I suspect that the size of these bosses is merely for lore and helps provide a sense of grandeur as you're fighting ravenous beasts and quite literally the gods in this game. However, the feeling I got standing underneath these bosses being forced to jump to reach them like a little kid going for a cookie jar on the fridge is not as epic as I believe From wanted it to be. Not only that, there are few things worse in a boss encounter than not being able to comprehend what is taking place because I'm stabbing at the boss's legs the entire time as the boss does his own thing above me. There were multiple instances where I failed to dodge in the right direction or anything similar because I could not see what the boss was doing due to its size. It could have very well been the approach I took. But that does not change the fact that giant bosses, in my eyes, are not very fun to fight. Regardless, even with the mechanical gripes that I had with the bosses, I still found them way too easy, as so many could just be brought down through brute force from my seemingly overleveled character. And that was the final nail in the coffin for me. In all honesty, having so little trouble with the bosses is probably the most disappointing part of the game for me. I play the Soulsborne series for the boss encounters, and for them to be as easy as they were, really put a damper on the experience. Before I finish my discussion on bosses, I would like to end it on a higher note by talking about my 4 favorites: Father Gascoigne, the Blood-Starved Beast, the Watchdog of the Old Lords, and Queen Yharnam. Father Gascoigne was my first real introduction to Bloodborne, as the very first time I tried playing it, I unknowingly skipped past the Cleric Beast. Gascoigne was one of my favorite humanoid bosses in the game, with 3 distinct phases and an unrelenting nature that kept me backstepping for days. There was not a slow moment when I was fighting Gascoigne, and it was riveting to fight someone that kept me on edge as much as him. Not many other bosses made me as tense as Gascoigne, and I have to give him credit for that. However, if I'm going to talk about my favorite bosses in Bloodborne, Blood-Starved Beast needs to be mentioned. He was by far the most difficult encounter for me in the base game, and I love him all the more for it. While his poison mechanic was kind of annoying, it was nothing an antidote could not handle. But what I really liked about Blood-Starved Beast was that he was the monster boss I wish we had more of in the main story. He was just as grotesque and menacing as the Cleric Beast or Amygdala, but his encounter did not suffer due to his size. He was alert, agile, and destructive if you managed to get hit by some of his combos. And learning how to parry him effectively was another task in and of itself. Blood-Starved Beast was the perfect monster fight in my opinion, and I really enjoyed every attempt I had on it. Next, we head into the Chalice dungeon bosses that stuck out to me, the first being the Watchdog of the Old Lords. I came to love the Watchdog immensely after fighting him in the Cursed Defiled Chalice, because not only is he a monster fight that is more on the comprehensible side, he was also immensely challenging for me as I learned his attack patterns and timings over the many attempts I had on him. In some of the other chalices, he is mostly forgettable. But, as I mentioned, I really enjoyed the Watchdog in the Cursed Defiled Chalice due to the fact that I actually got to see the boss more than once or twice, and he put up the fight for which I was craving, and I felt that his size did not negatively affect his encounter as much as some of the other monster fights. Finally, I want to talk about Queen Yharnam. She is the final Chalice dungeon boss, and I believe she is altogether my favorite in the entire game. I would not necessarily write home about her difficulty, but for her, I did not mind as much because her mechanical depth was phenomenal in comparison to others. She had a wide range of attacks that kept you at a distance. She summoned mirror images of herself, and even her baby helped in some capacity by stunning you if you stood near the queen when the baby cried. Every little piece of the Queen Yharnam encounter amalgamated into what I found to be the most mechanically deep fight in the game, and that had me smiling ear to ear when fighting her. Lastly, in this section, I'm going to discuss some of the aspects of Bloodborne that simply piss me off, and I want to get these complaints off my chest. Firstly, some minor grievances that are more personal. I hated the hunter fights. They took way too many hits and dealt so much damage that it seemed way too off balance. It gets even better when someone decided to take 3 of them in the same room, which in all honesty took me what felt like an hour to defeat. Even then, I had to sneak up behind 2 of them and spam backstab viscerals to succeed. In my initial playthrough, they were by far the most difficult part about the game. And the worst part being is that they were not even that fun to fight. Mostly because I was not very good at fighting them, but partly because they felt way too tanky for what they were. I also despised the frenzy mechanic. Having the brain ladies take so much damage to kill while they constantly apply essentially a one-shot mechanic on the player is simply more frustrating than anything else. I totally understand the lore behind it, but I wish the brain ladies were easier to kill, or the moment you look away from the brain, the frenzy meter stopped progressing. The idea that the frenzy continued to grow even after the lady was dead felt like a power drill going into my temple. Secondly, I was immediately annoyed the moment I discovered that the blood vials were a limited resource, in contrast to Estus flasks, which refilled every time one died or rested at a bonfire. The same principle applies to the bullets, however, it does make more sense in my eyes for the bullets to be a resource, so I'm a little more forgiving on them. Getting back on track, the limited blood vial debacle shaped the way I approached Bloodborne, as I did everything I could to avoid using them, besides during select occasions, such as boss fights and hunter encounters. In just about every other situation, I would run around with diminished health because I did not want to waste blood vials exploring the world. As a result, I have never had to farm for either bullets or blood vials, and currently sit on 600 of each most of the time because of how much I die due to me almost never healing. Therefore, it is almost a little bit of good, little bit of bad in that I never had to break the pace of my playthrough by farming, but I believe I should never have had the issue of limited healing put on the table at all. The best guess I can propose to why this system was implemented was to encourage players to kill enemies on the way to the boss rather than skipping them like many do in Dark Souls after discovering the location of the boss. However, I do not believe this approach was the best idea because for most players, running out of either bullets or vials is nothing more than a nuisance that kills the pacing of the game, especially after fighting a boss for a while only for you to be forced to return to Central Yharnam to get more healing items. Lastly, there are the Chalice dungeons. I love the idea of them. Being able to have essentially infinite endgame content was such a welcome concept that I hopped right on board. I did not get the chance to do any on my first playthrough because I did not realize you were sent straight into New Game Plus after fighting the Moon Presence. So when I got into the Hunter stream again in New Game Plus, I jumped straight into the first Chalice. The initial ones fell quite easily because apparently you were meant to do them right as you got the Chalices, but going in on New Game Plus made me severely overpowered. Now that I have gone through all of the dungeons, I have seen a wide array of difficulties that were not seen in the base game. While I can appreciate that the higher depth dungeons did provide the challenge I was looking for, they were still fraught with issues. Whether it be with the repetitiveness of the levels or bosses, I actually got sick of going through them. Traversing the same areas with the same lowbrow bosses with the occasional unique boss that is truly interesting just does not grip me like the main game did, even though the main game is easier most of the time. However, the worst part about the dungeons were by far the bosses. The couple of exceptions to that rule being the Watchdog and Queen Yharnam, aside from them, you have lazy repeats of enemies you fight throughout the dungeons or the base game themselves, such as the Merciless Watchers, the Lorn Silverbeasts, the Keeper of the Old Lords, Brainsuckers, the Beast-Possessed Soul, Undead Giants, and Man-Eater Boars. There are also a fair few bosses taken from the base game stuck into the dungeons as well, which, in my eyes, is simply lazy. There were only a handful of bosses that were unique to these Chalice dungeons, and I find that very disappointing. I know they were designed to be procedurally generated, and that there needed to be a wide range of bosses to draw from in order to ensure that they remained varied over repeated runs, but I'm thinking that having fewer, yet larger dungeons with more unique boss encounters would have been much better. Alright, this was a quick one, but that does it for me today and my thoughts on Bloodborne. I genuinely had a good time with the game, regardless of my complaints, and hope for something even better to come out from Software next. What did you guys think about Bloodborne? Did you love it? Hate it? Have you never played Bloodborne? Tell me your thoughts, and if you have any questions, quarrels, or queries, be sure to let me know. I am Cucumber, and remember, pass the dressing.